Hello and welcome back to the Microlearning Institute. In this short tutorial we're going to look at the topic of stakeholder analysis, and specifically we're going to look at a model developed by Mendelow to help us with this stakeholder analysis. A key aspect of formulating corporate strategy in any organization is that we understand the requirements of the key stakeholders of that organization. The objectives of an organization and the strategic direction will then be governed by these key stakeholders. The key stakeholders will be determined using a technique called stakeholder mapping. And Mendelow's matrix is probably one of the most popular techniques for performing this stakeholder mapping. Stakeholder mapping involves making decisions on the following two issues with respect to each stakeholder. Firstly, how interested is each particular stakeholder to impress their expectations on the organization's strategy? And secondly, to what extent each individual stakeholder has the power to impose its requirements on the organization. Firstly, let's look at interest and what that means. The level of interest of a stakeholder can be described as how likely it is that a stakeholder will take some sort of action to exercise his or her power on the organization. Interest can be influenced by perhaps having a high personal, financial or career investment in what the organization does, or perhaps by an absence of alternatives, that really an individual or an entity is totally committed to one organization because they don't have an alternative of moving to another. Or the potential to be called to account for or to be found accountable for failing to monitor something. For example, local councils or government agencies such as regulators and so on are highly interested because they are accountable for the outcomes. Or finally, the social impact of a firm, if the firm is very well known, if it's a very visible product, and so on. The other characteristic of a stakeholder that we want to look at with Mendelow's matrix is the stakeholder's power. Again, the ability to resign and consequently scupper the strategy, or to withdraw labour, or to cancel orders, or refuse to sell, the calling in of an overdraft or a long-term debt, dismissal of directors, the ability to impose legal action, the ability to grant a contract or to set remuneration, all are indicators of high power of an individual or an entity. Legislation tends to move power away from shareholders to other stakeholders. For example, employee protection legislation moves power to employees and away from management and shareholders. Similarly, environmental protection legislation moves power to the local community and other interested partners. And finally, we can consider that consumer legislation moves power to the customers. Mendelow's matrix then proposes to help us analyse these stakeholders. And Mendelow's matrix we can see is a 2x2 matrix with, on the x-axis indicated across the top, we show the level of interest, and we make a judgment as to whether the level of interest of each stakeholder is low or high. And similarly on the y-axis we do the same for power, again making a judgment as to whether the level of power that each stakeholder possesses is either low or high. So let's look at the outcomes in each of those boxes and how maybe best we can determine to manage these stakeholders. So the matrix is completed with regard to the stakeholder impact of a particular strategy. The purpose is to assess whether stakeholder resistance is likely to inhibit the success of the strategy and what policies may ease the acceptance of the strategy. So looking again at the matrix, and this time let us focus on box A here, and box A has the stakeholders who have low power and low interest. So Mendelow's matrix says that as an organization we should expend minimum effort on these stakeholders. Their lack of interest and power makes them open to influence, and they are more likely than others to accept what they are told and to follow instructions. Now let's look at the stakeholders that we've categorized in box B. And as you can see with box B, again these stakeholders have low power, but different to the stakeholders in box A, these guys now have high levels of interest. And Mendelow proposes that the best strategy for these stakeholders is to keep them informed. These stakeholders are interested in the strategy, but they lack the power to do anything about it. Management needs to convince opponents to the strategy that the strategic plans are justified. Otherwise, the stakeholders who occupy this box will try to gain power by joining with parties in boxes C and D, whom we're going to look at soon. Next, let's have a look at the stakeholders in box C. And these stakeholders, although they have very low interest in the strategy, their power to determine whether the strategy proceeds or whether they can withdraw support for the strategy, their power is deemed to be quite high. And Mendelow proposes that the best strategic approach for these stakeholders is to keep them satisfied. The key here is to keep these stakeholders satisfied in order to avoid them gaining interest or moving to box D. This could involve reassuring them of the outcomes of the strategy well in advance of implementation. Finally, let's have a look at the key stakeholders, who are the guys in box D. And we can see that these stakeholders possess high power and also possess high levels of interest in the strategy being pursued. Mendelow refers to these types of stakeholders as key players in the strategic direction of the organization. These stakeholders, they're the major drivers of change, and they could stop management plans if they are not fully satisfied with the strategy. Management therefore need to communicate plans to these stakeholders and then discuss the implementation issues until all parties are satisfied. Thank you very much for watching this short tutorial from the Microlearning Institute on stakeholder analysis using Mendelow's matrix.